All right, let's jump into something really interesting today. We're going to be doing a deep dive into Chapter 2 of Reality Transurfing, this book that claims it's got a unique take on achieving our goals.
This chapter really grabs you right from the start, doesn't it? It introduces this whole idea of destructive pendulums that are secretly influencing our lives.
Yeah, it's not about like literal pendulum swinging back and forth, is it?
Oh, no.
The book defines them as these energy structures, almost like these invisible forces.
Yeah.
They get created when a whole bunch of people are thinking the same way about something.
And what's really fascinating is the chapter argues that these pendulums, they actually feed on negativity. And the more people who buy into that fear or anger or frustration, the stronger the pendulum becomes.
Okay, so let's say I'm working towards like a specific goal. How would these pendulums get in my way? What would that actually look like in the real world?
Well, imagine you're working on a project, right? You're full of enthusiasm. And then suddenly, you're hit with this wave of self-doubt. And that doubt might not even be yours. It could be the energy of the failure pendulum latching onto you.
So it's almost like we're susceptible to these collective thought forms. And they can pull us away from our own paths without us even realizing it.
Exactly. The chapter uses the example of those groups of people who just love to criticize everything. You know, the ones who always find something to complain about, they're actually fueling a pendulum. And if you get drawn into their energy, you end up giving your energy to that pendulum too, instead of, focusing on your own goals.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But then the chapter goes even further, talking about this concept of the battle of the pendulums. What is that all about?
Well, the author argues that these pendulums are constantly competing for followers, for our attention and energy. And he gives some pretty dramatic examples, like how new technologies have historically been met with resistance and even suppression because they threaten the existing power structures, the existing pendulums.
So it's like these invisible forces are battling it out in the background, using us as like pawns in their game.
In a way, yes. And the chapter really highlights how these pendulums use our emotions as puppet strings. They know exactly what buttons to push to trigger our fear or guilt or anxiety, even our desires, and just keep us hooked.
This is starting to feel a little ominous.
Yeah.
So how do we break free from this? Do we even stand a chance against these powerful pendulums?
Well, the book suggests two main strategies: defeating the pendulum and stopping the pendulum. And what's interesting is that defeating the pendulum doesn't mean fighting it head on, which would actually just give it more energy.
So it's more about outsmarting them.
It's about recognizing their existence without letting them control you. The chapter uses this really powerful analogy of a man with a sledgehammer swinging at you. Instead of trying to block the sledgehammer, which would be impossible, you simply step aside and let that force pass by harmlessly.
Okay, so acceptance and non-resistance are key here. But what about those situations where ignoring it just isn't an option? Like, what if someone is directly confronting you, trying to provoke a reaction? That's where stopping the pendulum comes in, right?
Precisely. The author talks about his friend who was being harassed on a tram. And instead of getting drawn into a confrontation, he did something completely unexpected, something humorous, which totally diffused the situation and stopped the pendulum in its tracks.
And it's almost like these pendulums thrive on predictability, on following a certain script.
Yeah.
So if you break the script, you do something unexpected, it throws them off balance.
Exactly. It's about shifting the energy. The book also gives this example of visualizing annoying people as penguins. It sounds silly, but it highlights how even a simple shift in perspective can change your whole emotional state.
So if we're constantly being bombarded by these destructive pendulums, is it even possible to completely escape their influence? It feels like they're everywhere.
The author doesn't claim that it's easy, but he emphasizes that it's about developing a new level of awareness and making conscious choices about where you direct your energy.
So it's not about becoming completely immune to these pendulums. It's more about learning to recognize them, navigate around them, and choose which ones we engage with.
Precisely. It's about taking control of our own energy and using it to create the reality we want, rather than letting ourselves be pulled in directions we don't want to go.
All of this is definitely making me rethink how I approach everyday situations. I'm already starting to see these pendulums everywhere. But I have to admit, this idea of defeating and stopping these invisible forces still feels a bit abstract.
Are there more concrete techniques we can use? There are. And that's what we'll be exploring in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll delve into some practical examples and exercises from the chapter that can help you apply these concepts in your own life.
So we spent like the first part of this deep dive talking about these destructive pendulums, and frankly, it's been a little unsettling realizing how much they might be influencing our lives. But the chapter doesn't just like leave us there, right? It offers some tools for us to actually deal with these things.
Absolutely. The author goes beyond just identifying the problem, and he really starts to outline a methodology for taking back control. And one of the most intriguing ideas is this concept of renting yourself out.
Okay, renting yourself out. Now that sounds a little strange. What exactly does that mean in this context?
Well, it's about detaching emotionally from a problem you're facing. The book uses the example of a musician performing on stage. If they get too caught up in their own anxieties or the expectations of the audience, their performance suffers.
So they need to step back from their own emotional involvement, almost like they're observing themselves from outside the situation.
Precisely. By renting themselves out, they can focus on the task at hand. Like playing the music to the best of their ability without getting bogged down by those anxieties. And the chapter argues that this principle can apply to any problem we're facing, really.
That's a really interesting concept, but how do we actually put that into practice? It sounds like it takes a lot of mental discipline.
It does, and it's definitely something that requires practice. But the book offers some specific exercises to help us develop this detachment. One technique that really stood out to me was this idea of visualizing yourself solving the problem, but as if you were advising someone else.
So instead of getting all tangled up in my own emotions, I should imagine that I'm giving advice to a friend who's going through the same situation.
Exactly. By stepping outside of yourself, you can often see the solution more clearly. You're not weighed down by your own personal baggage, or the energy of the pendulum that might be feeding on your fear or frustration.
Okay, I can see how that could be helpful. But what about when the pendulum is coming from another person? Like, what if it's your boss who is creating all of this negativity and pressure? Is there a way to, like, stop the pendulum in that kind of situation?
The book has a really fascinating approach to this. It suggests that instead of resisting the pendulum, you actually give it what it wants, but in a way that benefits you.
Now, that sounds a little counterintuitive. How does that work?
The chapter gives an example of a boss who's constantly demanding and putting pressure on their employees. The author suggests that instead of getting caught up in the stress and frustration, you actually visualize that boss getting what they truly crave. Maybe it's recognition, a sense of control, or just some peace of mind.
So you're essentially using your imagination to shift the energy of the situation, to give the pendulum what it wants so that it stops swinging so wildly.
Exactly. And the author argues that by doing this, you're not only diffusing that negative energy, but you're also subtly influencing the other person's behavior. They're likely to become more receptive to you because you're no longer feeding their pendulum with your own resistance.
That's a really powerful idea. But honestly, it still feels a little bit like magic to me. How do we know if it actually works?
Well, the book doesn't present this as like a guaranteed formula, but rather as a shift in perspective, a way of approaching problems that can lead to some surprisingly positive outcomes. It's about moving from a place of reaction to a place of conscious action.
So it's about taking back control of our own energy and using it in a more deliberate way.
Precisely. And what's really empowering about this approach is that it doesn't require us to change other people. It's about changing our own internal state and how we interact with the world around us.
Okay, this is all starting to click into place for me now. We're not just talking about like avoiding negativity here. We're talking about using our understanding of these pendulums to actually solve problems and achieve our goals more effectively.
And what's really exciting is that this is just the tip of the iceberg. The chapter goes on to talk about how we can actually harness the power of pendulums to work for us rather than against us.
Wait, so they're actually beneficial pendulums too. Tell me more. Okay, so we've gone from feeling a bit helpless against these like destructive pendulums to learning how to sidestep them, even use their energy to our advantage. But now you're saying there are pendulums that can actually help us achieve our goals. I'm a little skeptical, I gotta admit, but very intrigued.
It might seem kind of counterintuitive at first, but remember, pendulums are just energy structures fueled by collective thought. So the real question is, can we tap into that energy in a positive way? Can we actually align ourselves with pendulums that support our aspirations? And the author of this book, well, he definitely seems to think so.
So instead of being swept along by the current, we're talking about choosing our own wave to ride.
That's a great way to put it. The book actually uses the term transurfing to describe this whole thing. It's about becoming aware of those different energy currents out there, those pendulums, and then, making conscious choices about which ones we want to ride.
Okay, so how do we find these beneficial pendulums? Do we just think really hard about our goals and hope they magically appear?
Well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. But focusing on your goals is definitely the starting point. The chapter really emphasizes how important it is to identify those goals that are truly aligned with your values and passions, not just the goals that society or other people have kind of imposed on you.
So step one is getting really clear on what we truly want, not what we think we should want.
Exactly. It's about digging deep and finding those desires that really resonate at your core. And once you've identified those goals, you can start to visualize yourself actually achieving them, feeling those emotions, that sense of accomplishment, as if it's already happening.
So we're talking about the power of visualization here,
Hmm.
like really creating a strong mental image of the outcome we desire.
Exactly. The chapter emphasizes that visualization is a key technique in this whole transurfing thing. By creating these vivid mental pictures, we're essentially aligning our energy with the frequency of our desired outcome. We're starting to attract those people, resources, and opportunities that can help us reach those goals.
So it's almost like we're sending out a signal and the universe is responding by bringing us what we need. But it can't just be about sitting back and daydreaming, right? We have to take some action too.
Oh, absolutely. Visualization without action is just fantasy. The book's very clear about that. It emphasizes that we need to be actively moving towards our goals, taking steps, making choices that align with our vision.
So it's a combination of both internal and external work. We're shifting our energy internally through visualization, setting clear intentions, but we're also taking those concrete steps in the real world to bring those goals closer.
And what's really interesting is that the chapter suggests that as we do this, we'll start to notice synchronicities popping up. Things will kind of seem to fall into place more easily. It's like the universe is conspiring to help us achieve our dreams.
It's almost like, by choosing to align ourselves with these beneficial pendulums, we're stepping into this flow state where things just start working out in our favor.
Exactly. And that's the power of understanding this concept. It allows us to move from a place of feeling like we're constantly battling against the current to a place where we're riding those waves of energy in a direction that supports our growth and fulfillment.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We've gone from feeling at the mercy of these unseen forces to recognizing that we actually have a say in how they influence our lives.
We can choose to let them drain our energy and hold us back, or we can learn to navigate them, use their power to our advantage, and ultimately create a reality that is much more aligned with our deepest desires.
So I think as we wrap up this deep dive, the biggest takeaway for me is that we have a lot more agency than we often realize. We can become conscious creators of our own reality, not just by setting goals, but by actively aligning our energy with the forces that support those goals.
And remember, it's a journey of exploration. As we become more aware of these pendulums, we can start to make more conscious choices about where we direct our attention, our energy, and ultimately our lives. Who knows what amazing possibilities await us when we learn to transurf reality in this way.
Food for thought indeed, and a perfect place to end this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, happy transurfing.